Winter mornings in Hamtramck, 1910. The kind where your breath freezes before it leaves your mouth. Smoke from the foundries mixed with fog so thick you couldn't see across the street. Inside the new Dodge main complex, furnaces roared at temperatures that turned metal into liquid. The noise was constant, the kind that made your ears ring for hours after your shift ended. 35 city blocks of factory floor. Enough space to hide 1,000 secrets. The Dodge brothers built this place with Ford's money, then used it to compete against the man who made them rich. The question isn't whether they succeeded. The question is, who paid for that success? The land was cheap in 1910. Hamtramck sat outside Detroit's city limits, surrounded by Polish farms and German breweries, close to the rail lines, but far from expensive downtown real estate. John and Horace Dodge had been building parts for Henry Ford since 1903, supplying nearly every component except tires and bodies. Ford paid 10% of gross sales. By 1910, the brothers had accumulated $5 to $7 million. Enough to build their own empire. They purchased 35 acres in February 1910. The scale was unprecedented for a private manufacturer. Construction began in March. The main building would be 6 stories tall, reinforced concrete and steel, 900 windows along the south wall alone. The roof held water tanks with 80,000 gallons for fire suppression. Nothing about this plant was small. The first section opened in November 1910. By 1914, when the first Dodge automobile rolled off the line, the plant covered 35 acres and employed 4,000 workers. The design was vertical integration made physical. Raw materials entered on the north side. The foundry melted iron at 2,800 degrees. Machine shops turned castings into precision parts. Assembly lines built complete vehicles. By 1916, Dodge Main produced 400 cars per day. That output placed them among the top 5 manufacturers in America. By 1917, they ranked 4th nationally, producing 120,000 vehicles annually. The profit margins were substantial. The risk had paid off. What nobody mentioned was the cost of moving that much material, that much heat, through buildings designed for speed rather than safety. The foundry ran 24 hours a day, 3 shifts without pause. Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving. The furnaces never cooled. Each shift employed roughly 800 men in the foundry alone. They faced temperatures exceeding 110 degrees even in winter. In summer, the heat became something else, something that killed. Official records are incomplete. Dodge Brothers was private until 1920. They weren't required to report workplace accidents to any federal agency. Michigan had workers' compensation laws, but enforcement was limited for companies with political influence. The Dodge Brothers had influence, but some stories survived. In 1915, a ladle carrying 3 tons of molten iron tipped. 4 workers caught in the splash. 2 died within hours. The others lingered for days before infections killed them. The company paid funeral expenses and gave each family $200. No admission of fault, no changes to procedure. Production resumed the next day. By 1920, Dodge Main employed 15,000. Between 1914 and 1920, at least 43 workers died from industrial accidents, 7 per year, 1 death every 52 days. Those are only the documented deaths. Minor injuries, permanent disabilities, chronic illnesses from metal dust. Those never made the count. The brothers knew. John walked the factory floor several times a week. Horace supervised engineering directly. They saw the conditions, they understood the risks, but production numbers kept rising, and rising numbers meant profits. When John Dodge died in 1920 from pneumonia, newspapers called him a titan of industry. His funeral drew thousands. Workers lined the streets, some weeping. Whether from grief or fear of losing their jobs, no one could say. Horace followed within months. At 56 and 52, neither lived to see what would happen to their empire. The widows sold everything. They wanted cash, security, an end to managing 15,000 employees. In July 1920, they sold Dodge Brothers Motor Company to Dillon, Reed and Company for $146 million, the highest price ever paid for an American business. $146 million in 1920, roughly $2 billion in current dollars. The Dodge brothers had turned $5 million into a company worth 30 times that much in barely a decade. The widows walked away, took their money and left the automotive industry. Their names appear on buildings across Michigan. The workers who died building that wealth have no buildings named after them. The plant kept growing under new ownership. By 1928, employment peaked at 35,000 workers across 3 shifts, producing up to 2,000 vehicles per day. The complex covered 45 acres. Dodge, Maine was no longer just a factory. It was a city within a city. Hamtramck changed to accommodate the growth. Population exploded from 5,000 in 1910 to 56,000 by 1930. Polish immigrants formed the majority. They built churches, schools, bought homes within walking distance. Entire families depended on those wages. When Dodge, Maine sneezed, Hamtramck caught pneumonia. In 1928, Chrysler Corporation purchased Dodge Brothers for $170 million. Walter Chrysler saw value in the brand, the distribution network, the production capacity. Most of all, he saw value in Dodge, Maine itself. A fully integrated complex, ready to produce, already profitable. The workers kept building cars through the ownership changes, through the boom years. They punched in, worked their shifts, punched out. The furnaces stayed hot. The machines kept running. Until they didn't. October 1929. The stock market collapsed, not slowly, not with warning, not with time to adjust. It collapsed in days, taking entire fortunes with it, destroying family wealth that had taken generations to accumulate, bankrupting banks and brokerages and investment trusts. Chrysler's stock dropped 70% in the first month, wiping out paper wealth, destroying balance sheets, creating panic among investors who had borrowed to buy stock on margin. Orders for new vehicles stopped, not reduced, stopped. Dealerships across the country closed their doors, unable to pay for inventory, unable to secure credit, unable to sell vehicles to consumers who suddenly had no money and no confidence in the future. And Dodge, Maine, with 35,000 workers on payroll, suddenly had no cars to build. The layoffs began in November 1929. First, the newest hires, workers with 6 months or a year of seniority, men who had moved their families to Hamtramck specifically for these jobs, who now had no work and no savings and no prospects. Then anyone without significant seniority, anyone who couldn't be protected by union contracts that didn't yet exist in enforceable form. By January 1930, employment had dropped to 12,000. By spring, 8,000. The fortunate ones kept their jobs but lost their hours, working 2 or 3 days a week instead of 6, earning 30 or 40% of their previous wages. Many eventually lost their jobs entirely as demand continued falling through 1930, 1931, 1932. The Depression didn't end quickly. It ground on for years, destroying lives slowly, methodically, without drama, just steady erosion of hope and security and dignity. Hamtramck starved. Literally starved. Families that had lived on $700 per year suddenly had nothing. Savings evaporated within months. Credit dried up as banks failed, and those that survived stopped lending. The city didn't have the infrastructure for mass relief, didn't have food banks, unemployment insurance, government assistance programs. Those systems didn't exist yet. The churches did what they could, establishing soup kitchens that served watery stew and bread to hundreds of families daily. The Polish Women's Alliance organized food distribution. collecting donations from those who still had something to give, providing what they could to those who had nothing. The Communist Party opened a food distribution center on Joseph Campau Avenue, handing out bread and potatoes donated by sympathetic farmers, gaining support among workers who felt abandoned by both the company that had laid them off and the government that offered no help, no protection, no safety net. Dodge, Maine became a symbol of industrial collapse. The massive complex, built to represent American prosperity and industrial might, now stood mostly empty, machines silent, furnaces cold for the first time since 1910. The company couldn't afford to heat the buildings they weren't using, couldn't afford to maintain equipment that wasn't running, couldn't afford the property taxes on 45 acres of idle real estate. Pipes froze and burst during the brutal winters, flooding buildings, destroying what equipment remained. Roofs leaked, allowing rain and snow to damage floors and walls. Rust spread across tools left idle too long. Machinery seized from lack of lubrication, irreplaceable components deteriorated from neglect. But Chrysler didn't abandon the plant, couldn't abandon it. The company had invested too heavily in the facilities, had integrated Dodge, Maine too completely into their production system, and despite the depression, despite the catastrophic collapse in demand, they believed recovery would come. They believed demand would return. American prosperity was temporarily disrupted, not permanently ended. That was the assumption. That was the hope everyone clung to because the alternative was unthinkable. In 1933, with the economy still broken but showing slight signs of recovery, with Roosevelt in office and New Deal programs beginning to inject money into the economy, Dodge, Maine restarted limited production. 5,000 workers, one shift, 50 cars per day. It was something. It was survival. The workers who got those jobs considered themselves fortunate, though they earned less than they had in 1928, though working conditions had deteriorated during the shutdown, though the future remained deeply uncertain. President Roosevelt's New Deal programs helped, marginally, gradually. The National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 set minimum wages and maximum hours, giving workers some protection from the worst exploitation. The Wagner Act of 1935 gave them the legal right to organize unions without employer retaliation, to engage in collective bargaining, to strike without being immediately fired and permanently blacklisted. These laws didn't change everything overnight. They took years to implement, years to enforce, faced constant legal challenges from employers who saw them as government overreach. But they changed the equation at Dodge, Maine, shifted the power balance slightly toward workers, created space for organization that hadn't existed before. The United Automobile Workers Union, founded in 1935 under the umbrella of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, targeted Dodge, Maine immediately. The scale, the history, the symbolic importance all made it a priority organizing target. But Chrysler resisted. The company hired private security firms, Pinkerton and others, to monitor union organizers, to infiltrate union meetings, to identify and report workers who showed union sympathy. They fired suspected union supporters for trivial infractions, real or invented. They used company spies to attend secret organizing meetings and report names back to management. The intimidation was systematic, pervasive, effective, up to a point. But the law was on the workers' side now, at least theoretically, and the union kept organizing despite the intimidation, kept building support, kept preparing for the confrontation everyone knew was coming. The tension built slowly, invisibly at first, pressure accumulating behind a dam that couldn't hold forever. And then it broke. March 8, 1937. Workers arrived for the morning shift to find the gates locked. Not by management, by their fellow workers on the inside. A sit-down strike, organized by the UAW in complete secrecy, had begun overnight. 800 workers occupied the plant, refusing to leave, refusing to work, refusing to allow anyone else to work, refusing to surrender the physical space they controlled. They brought food, blankets, playing cards, books, everything needed to sustain themselves indefinitely. They were prepared to stay as long as necessary, as long as it took to force Chrysler to recognize the union and negotiate in good faith. The sit-down strike was a new tactic, recently successful at General Motors plants in Flint. The logic was simple. If workers simply walked off the job, management could hire replacements and resume production. But if workers occupied the plant, controlling the machinery, preventing access, then management couldn't operate, even if they wanted to hire strikebreakers. The company couldn't remove the occupiers without using force, and using force risked public relations disasters, legal complications, even criminal charges if anyone was seriously injured or killed. The sit-down strike put management in an impossible position, which was exactly the point. Chrysler responded with private security, armed guards who surrounded the complex within hours, preventing anyone from entering or leaving except through checkpoints controlled by the company. The siege lasted 9 days. 9 days of standoff, negotiation, threats, tension that could have exploded into violence at any moment. The workers inside slept on factory floors, cold concrete with thin blankets, no real privacy, no comfortable accommodations. They rationed their supplies carefully, making food last, making sure everyone got enough to sustain themselves. They sang union songs that echoed through empty machine shops, Solidarity Forever and Which Side Are You On? Songs that built morale, that reminded them why they were doing this, what they were fighting for. They played cards, told stories, waited. Outside, other workers picketed, chanted, demonstrated their support, created a perimeter that made any police intervention more complicated. Police arrived on the 5th day, attempting to force entry through the south gates on Holbrook Avenue. 100 officers armed with clubs and tear gas canisters, backed by city officials who wanted the standoff resolved before it escalated further. The workers inside defended their position with fire hoses, blasting freezing water at advancing officers, throwing metal scraps and lumber and anything else they could find. The police responded with tear gas, firing canisters through broken windows, trying to force the occupiers to evacuate. 17 workers were injured, 3 seriously enough to require medical attention, though none died. The violence was enough. The newspapers covered the confrontation with photographs of police attacking workers, images that reminded readers too much of the Pinkertons and Haymarket and all the other times armed force had been used against labor organizing. Public opinion shifted slightly toward the strikers, not overwhelmingly, not universally, but enough. Enough that Michigan's Governor Frank Murphy intervened, pressuring Chrysler to negotiate rather than escalate. Enough that Chrysler's leadership recognized they couldn't win through force without creating a public relations catastrophe that might damage the company's reputation permanently. On the 9th day, March 17, 1937, Chrysler agreed to negotiate. The company recognized the UAW as the legitimate bargaining agent for Dodge Main workers. In exchange, the strike ended, production resumed, and both sides claimed victory. But the real victory belonged to the workers. For the first time in the plant's history, they had leverage. They had a voice. They had protection against arbitrary dismissal and unsafe conditions. They had the right to negotiate collectively over wages, hours, working conditions, everything that affected their daily lives on the factory floor. The changes came slowly, incrementally, through negotiations that took months and years. Safety equipment became mandatory in the foundry, gloves and face shields and protective aprons that reduced injuries, though didn't eliminate them. Ventilation systems were upgraded, though never to truly adequate levels, never enough to fully protect workers from heat and toxic fumes and metal dust. Work hours were standardized at 8 hours per shift, with overtime pay at time and a half for anything beyond 40 hours per week. The most dangerous jobs received slight wage increases, 5 or 10 cents more per hour, not enough to truly compensate for the risk, but something, an acknowledgement that some jobs were worse than others. The company agreed to seniority systems that made layoffs more predictable, that protected workers who had invested years or decades in the plant. They agreed to grievance procedures that gave workers a way to challenge unfair treatment without being immediately fired. These were real victories. They mattered, they improved lives, but they didn't transform the fundamental relationship between capital and labor. Didn't change the fact that Chrysler owned the plant and made all strategic decisions without worker input. Didn't change the fact that workers remained disposable when the company needed to cut costs. The power imbalance was reduced, not eliminated. The victories were partial, not complete, but they were more than workers had ever had before, and they were enough to build on. And then the war came. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The attack that pulled America into World War II, that ended isolationism, that transformed the entire American economy almost overnight. Within weeks, American automotive production shifted entirely to military contracts. Chrysler retooled Dodge Main to build aircraft engines, Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engines that powered B-26 Marauders and P-47 Thunderbolts, tank transmissions for Sherman tanks. Military trucks, 3/4-ton and 2.5-ton, the workhorses of military logistics. The government paid cost-plus contracts, guaranteeing profit margins regardless of actual expenses, essentially writing blank checks to ensure maximum production as quickly as possible. National survival depended on outproducing the Axis powers. Everything else was secondary. Employment surged back to 35,000 as the country mobilized for total war. The three-shift system returned, running 7 days a week, no holidays, no exceptions. Christmas Day, New Year's Day, Easter, Thanksgiving, the plant operated continuously because war doesn't pause for observance of cultural traditions. The furnaces never cooled. The machines never stopped. Workers earned overtime, double time for Sundays, bonuses for exceeding production targets. Families could afford meat again, new clothes, savings accounts. Hamtramck thrived like it hadn't since before the Depression. The prosperity was real, tangible, immediate. For the first time in over a decade, working people had money, had security, had hope. But the work was brutal. More brutal than anything before. Accidents increased with the accelerated pace, with the pressure to maximize production, with the fatigue that came from working 50 or 60 hours per week every week without real breaks. Exhaustion caused mistakes. Mistakes caused injuries. Injuries caused deaths. Between 1942 and 1945, at least 63 workers died at Dodge Main from industrial accidents, an average of 15 per year, one death every 24 days for 4 years straight. The numbers were higher than any peacetime period, higher even than the early years when safety equipment barely existed. But the government didn't care. The military needed engines, needed transmissions, needed trucks. Production targets took absolute priority over worker safety. The workers understood. They knew the risks. They accepted them because the alternative was losing the war, and losing the war meant something worse than industrial accidents. The company implemented hiring quotas that brought black workers into the plant for the first time in significant numbers. Not from progressive ideals, not from a sudden commitment to racial equality. From necessity. The labor pool was exhausted. White workers were either already employed in war industries or drafted into military service. The traditional sources of industrial labor had been depleted. Black workers from the South, migrating north for wartime opportunities, filled the gap. Between 1942 and 1945, roughly 10% of Dodge Main's workforce was black, a dramatic shift from the pre-war period when black workers had been largely excluded from automotive manufacturing. But integration was selective, deliberate, constrained by racial assumptions and explicit company policies. Black workers were assigned almost exclusively to the foundry, the hottest department, the most dangerous department, the department white workers avoided when possible. The racial logic was crude and obvious. The hottest, dirtiest, most physically demanding work went to black workers because management believed or claimed to believe that black workers could tolerate heat better, that they were naturally suited for heavy labor, that they didn't deserve or couldn't handle skilled positions. These weren't innocent assumptions. They were racist policies designed to maintain racial hierarchies within the workplace, to ensure that even in an integrated plant, black workers remained subordinate, confined to the bottom of the occupational ladder. Separate locker rooms, separate lunch areas, separate water fountains, even though Michigan had no official segregation laws, even though Detroit considered itself a northern city, free from southern racial customs. The separation was corporate policy, enforced by plant management, accepted by the white-dominated union leadership who saw black workers as competition rather than fellow workers. The UAW would eventually become a progressive force on civil rights. But in 1943, the union was still accommodating white workers' racism, still allowing discriminatory practices that contradicted its own stated principles. In June 1943, racial tensions exploded across Detroit. The Detroit race riot, sparked by competition for housing and jobs and long-standing resentments on both sides, killed 34 people over 3 days of violence. White mobs attacked black neighborhoods. Black residents fought back. Federal troops occupied the city to restore order, patrolling streets with fixed bayonets, imposing a kind of martial law until the violence subsided. Dodge Main continued operating throughout the riot, protected by armed guards and the simple fact that most workers, black and white, couldn't afford to lose their jobs, couldn't afford to be fired for participating in racial violence. The economic necessity of wartime employment temporarily suppressed the racial conflict, didn't eliminate it, just pushed it underground where it festered. After the riot, conditions in the foundry remained unchanged. Black workers continued in the most dangerous positions. White workers continued in skilled trades and supervision. The company made no statements, implemented no reforms, took no steps to address the underlying inequalities that had contributed to the violence. Production mattered. Racial harmony mattered only insofar as it affected production. As long as both groups showed up for their shifts, as long as the work got done, management considered the situation acceptable. When the war ended in August 1945, the military contracts ended with it. Chrysler laid off 15,000 workers within 3 months, workers who had endured years of dangerous wartime production, who had sacrificed safety and health and time with their families to support the war effort, who now found themselves unemployed as the economy shifted back towards civilian production. The company retooled for civilian vehicle production, converting assembly lines from aircraft engines back to automobile engines, from military trucks back to consumer vehicles. They reduced shifts from 3 back to 2. The brief prosperity vanished as quickly as it had arrived. Hamtramck's economy staggered, held upright only by the workers who remained, held together by the assumption that civilian automotive production would soon return to pre-war levels, that prosperity would resume, that the sacrifices would be worth it. But something had changed during the war years, something fundamental that would shape the next 3 decades. Workers had experienced real bargaining power, real protections, real wages that allowed middle-class lifestyles. They wouldn't accept less without fighting. The union was stronger, more organized, more confident, and management understood, whether they liked it or not, that the old paternalistic relationship was over. The new relationship would be contractual, adversarial, negotiated through collective bargaining and occasionally through strikes. Neither side fully trusted the other, but both sides needed each other. That mutual dependence would define the post-war decades. The 1950s brought prosperity, the kind that looked real from a distance, the kind that filled the pages of Life magazine and Look magazine with photographs of smiling families standing next to new cars, new houses, new appliances. Dodge Main produced full-size sedans, station wagons, pickup trucks, the large vehicles American families wanted and could increasingly afford. Employment stabilized around 28,000. Wages rose with inflation, sometimes ahead of it, fast enough that workers could save money, could plan for the future, could imagine their children having better lives. The dream looked achievable. A Dodge Main worker in 1955 earned approximately $4,000 per year if he worked steadily, roughly 6 times what his father might have earned in 1925. Adjusted for inflation, that was real income growth, real improvement in living standards. That wage supported a wife and 3 children in a modest suburban home, a 3-bedroom house with a garage and a yard, something that would have been unthinkable for factory workers a generation earlier. Workers bought new cars every few years, not used vehicles, but new ones, straight from dealerships. They bought televisions, refrigerators, washing machines, all the consumer goods that defined middle-class prosperity in post-war America. They took family vacations, drove to national parks, or visited relatives in other states, experiences their parents never had. Working-class life in the 1950s, at least for those who had stable manufacturing jobs, looked more like middle-class life than like the working-class poverty their parents had endured. But beneath the prosperity, costs were accumulating. Problems were building that wouldn't become obvious for years. The plant was aging. Buildings constructed in 1910 were now 40 years old. Their infrastructure outdated, inefficient, breaking down constantly. The foundry required continuous repairs to keep the furnaces operational, patches and replacements that cost more each year as original equipment became irreplaceable. The machine shops needed new equipment to maintain tolerances demanded by modern engines, precision that the old lathes and mills couldn't achieve consistently. The assembly lines, designed for simpler vehicles with manual transmissions and minimal electrical systems, struggled with the increasing complexity of 1950s automobiles that had automatic transmissions, power steering, power brakes, air conditioning, electrical systems with dozens of components. Chrysler invested sporadically, reactively, a new stamping press here when the old one finally failed completely, updated electrical systems there when code enforcement demanded it. But never comprehensively, never enough to bring the entire complex up to contemporary standards. The company operated on a philosophy of deferred maintenance, spending only what was absolutely necessary to prevent complete operational failure, postponing larger investments indefinitely, hoping that current facilities would remain adequate for just a few more years. Always a few more years. The pattern made financial sense, at least in the short term. Modernizing Dodge Main completely would require hundreds of millions of dollars, money that could be invested instead in new facilities elsewhere. Chrysler was building modern plants across the Detroit area through the 1950s, new facilities in Highland Park and Jefferson Avenue and Lynch Road, plants designed with current technology, current safety standards, current efficiency targets, plants that didn't carry the burden of ancient infrastructure and obsolete design. Dodge Main was legacy infrastructure, kept running through inertia and the political difficulty of closing a facility that employed tens of thousands, that anchored an entire community, that represented decades of accumulated investment and institutional knowledge. Workers knew what was happening. They could see the newer plants going up, could see the investment flowing elsewhere, could see that Dodge Main was no longer the crown jewel of Chrysler's manufacturing system. They talked among themselves, worried about the long-term future, wondered whether the company would eventually close the plant entirely. But they also knew Dodge Main was still profitable, still producing thousands of vehicles monthly, still essential to Chrysler's output. As long as the company made money, the plant would stay open. That was the assumption. That was the promise, implicit, if not stated. That was what sustained hope. The union negotiated aggressively during these years, leveraging the strong post-war economy and high demand for labor. The UAW, now powerful nationally with contracts at General Motors and Ford and Chrysler, demanded and received automatic cost of living increases that adjusted wages quarterly based on inflation measures. They demanded expanded healthcare coverage, insurance that covered not just the worker but his entire family, coverage that included hospitalization and surgery and prescription drugs. They demanded pension plans that promised security in retirement, defined benefit pensions that guaranteed a specific monthly payment for life, regardless of how long the retiree lived. By 1960, a Dodge Main worker with 20 years of seniority could expect to retire at 60 or 62 with a monthly pension of $200, enough to maintain a modest but comfortable life, enough to avoid poverty in old age, enough to preserve dignity. These benefits came with costs, though the costs weren't immediately obvious. The pension obligations accumulated, requiring Chrysler to set aside money to fund future payments, creating long-term liabilities that would become problematic if the company's profitability declined. The healthcare costs rose faster than inflation, medical expenses increasing every year as new treatments became available, as life expectancy increased, as usage expanded. The cost of living adjustments locked in wage growth regardless of productivity improvements, preventing the company from reducing labor costs during economic downturns. These obligations were contractual, legally binding, enforceable through the grievance process and ultimately through strikes if the company tried to renege. But those costs seemed manageable in the 1950s. The economy was growing. Chrysler was profitable. The future looked secure. The union and management reached accommodations, negotiated contracts that both sides could accept, established a pattern of labor relations that seemed sustainable indefinitely. Strikes still happened, brief work stoppages when negotiations broke down, but they were usually resolved quickly without fundamental damage to either side. The system worked as long as certain conditions held, as long as certain assumptions remained true. The compromise worked as long as the automotive market kept growing, as long as American manufacturers dominated, as long as consumers wanted the large, powerful, profitable vehicles Detroit produced, as long as gasoline remained cheap, roads kept expanding, and suburbanization continued driving demand for personal vehicles. But those conditions weren't permanent. They were contingent, temporary, fragile, and by the late 1960s, they were beginning to crack. Competition arrived quietly. Not with announcements or warning, not with fanfare or obvious threat. It arrived as small, fuel-efficient imports from Japan and Germany, vehicles that cost less to purchase, lasted longer with less maintenance, used less gasoline. Volkswagen Beetles, odd-looking but reliable and economical. Toyota Coronas, utilitarian but well-built. Datsun 510s, basic but sufficient for many buyers' needs. These weren't luxury vehicles. They weren't aspirational products. They were practical transportation for people who valued efficiency over size, reliability over power, economy over prestige. In 1960, imports represented less than 5% of the American automotive market. A rounding error, an irrelevant niche, nothing to worry about. By 1965, 10%, still manageable, still not threatening the Big Three's fundamental dominance. By 1970, 15%, now concerning, now requiring attention. By 1975, nearly 25%, now existential. Now threatening the entire business model American automotive companies had operated on for decades. Detroit noticed but didn't adapt, didn't fundamentally change strategy, didn't retool to compete directly against imports. The big three, General Motors and Ford and Chrysler, continued building large vehicles with large engines, six-cylinder and V8 engines that consumed gasoline at 12 or 15 miles per gallon. Vehicles that emphasized power and comfort over efficiency. Vehicles that had generated enormous profits for decades. They dismissed imports as temporary curiosities, unsuitable for American tastes, inadequate for American driving conditions, successful only because they were cheap and Americans would eventually recognize that you get what you pay for. They lobbied for tariffs and trade restrictions rather than improving their own products. They convinced themselves the market would return to normal, that American consumers' temporary flirtation with small foreign cars would end once they recognized the superiority of American engineering and American manufacturing. The market didn't return to normal. The assumptions that had guided Detroit for 50 years were being invalidated by global competition and changing consumer preferences. But changing course would have required acknowledging fundamental errors, admitting that American manufacturers had become complacent, investing billions in new product development when current products were still profitable. The institutional resistance was enormous. The cultural blindness was nearly complete. The oil crisis of 1973 changed everything in ways that couldn't be ignored. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, embargoed oil exports to the United States in retaliation for American support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War. The embargo lasted 6 months, but its effects persisted for years. Gasoline prices quadrupled within months, jumping from 25 cents per gallon to $1 or more, creating shortages, creating lines at gas stations, creating genuine panic among consumers who suddenly couldn't afford to fill their tanks. Consumers, suddenly paying 4 times more to operate their vehicles, reconsidered their choices. That gas-guzzling American sedan that got 12 miles per gallon became expensive to operate, impractical, almost obscene. That small, efficient import that got 30 miles per gallon suddenly made economic sense. The market shifted dramatically, permanently, in ways that American manufacturers couldn't immediately accommodate. Dodge Main, tooled to build large vehicles, couldn't pivot quickly. The assembly lines, the machinery, the entire production system was designed for specific vehicle sizes and configurations. Every station, every process, every tool was optimized for large bodies, large engines, large frames. Retooling would require shutting down production for months, spending hundreds of millions to redesign every station, every process, retraining every worker, replacing or modifying every piece of equipment. The timeline would be years, not months. The investment would be massive, and Chrysler couldn't afford that. The company was already struggling financially, posting losses in 1974 and 1975, burning through cash reserves, facing pressure from creditors and shareholders. Employment at the plant dropped steadily, from 28,000 in 1973 to 20,000 in 1975 to 18,000 in 1976 to 15,000 in 1977. Layoffs became routine, expected, dreaded. Workers with 30 years of seniority found themselves sent home indefinitely, waiting for recall notices that never came, watching their savings dwindle, facing the terrifying realization that they might never work again, that the security they'd built through decades of loyalty meant nothing when the company needed to cut costs. The cafeterias, once packed during shift changes with hundreds of workers eating lunch and dinner, sat half empty, echoing with the absence of the thousands who had been laid off. Entire buildings within the complex went dark, heat turned off to save money, machinery mothballed, production capacity that had cost millions to build now sitting idle, because there was no market for what it produced. Hamtramck began to die with the plant. the symbiotic relationship worked both directions. When the plant thrived, the city thrived. When the plant declined, the city declined. Businesses closed on Joseph Campeau Avenue. Stores that had operated for 30 or 40 years, suddenly unable to sustain themselves without the spending power of employed workers. Property values dropped as people left, as houses went into foreclosure, as neighborhoods that had been working-class stable became working-class desperate. Young people left for opportunities elsewhere, moving to other cities, other states, anywhere that offered employment, leaving behind aging parents and decaying infrastructure. The population that had peaked at 56,000 in 1930 and stabilized around 48,000 through the 1950s fell to 34,000 by 1975. The city's tax base collapsed. Essential services deteriorated. Schools closed as enrollment dropped. The police and fire departments operated with skeleton crews. The community that had grown symbiotically with Dodge Main withered as the plant's fortunes declined. But Chrysler kept Dodge Main operating despite the losses, producing whatever vehicles still sold, trying to outlast the crisis, trying to reach the point where demand would recover. The company's management believed, genuinely believed, that American consumers would return to large vehicles once gasoline prices stabilized. This was temporary disruption, not permanent change. They just needed to survive long enough to reach that recovery. That was the plan. That was the hope. That was what they told workers, told shareholders, told creditors, told themselves. The crisis passed, after a fashion. Gasoline prices stabilized by 1976, though never returning to pre-1973 levels, settling around 60 cents per gallon instead of $1, but never dropping back to a quarter. But consumer preferences had permanently shifted. Fuel efficiency mattered now in ways it hadn't before. Reliability mattered because people kept vehicles longer when they couldn't afford to replace them frequently. Build quality mattered because consumers had discovered that some manufacturers built better vehicles than others, that Toyota and Honda and Volkswagen products lasted longer and required less repair than comparable American vehicles. And on those metrics, imports outperformed American vehicles consistently, undeniably, in ways that consumer reporting and personal experience confirmed. Dodge Main limped through 1976 and 1977, producing fewer than 500 vehicles per day, a fraction of its capacity, a shadow of what it had been. The plant that once employed 35,000 now barely maintained 10,000 workers. Buildings constructed in the 1920s showed their age unmistakably now. Crumbling brick, leaking roofs, corroded infrastructure, structural problems that would cost millions to repair properly. Repairs were deferred again and again, postponed indefinitely, the company choosing to spend money keeping the plant barely operational rather than investing in comprehensive renovation. The complex looked like what it was. A relic from another era, kept alive through financial life support, through sheer institutional inertia, through the political impossibility of closing a facility that still represented the economic foundation of an entire community. Then in early 1978, Chrysler's board made a decision that would reshape Detroit's industrial landscape, that would end 70 years of history, that would destroy a community that had built its entire existence around a single employer. The announcement came in June 1978, brief, corporate, bloodless. Chrysler was closing Dodge Main permanently. All remaining production would transfer to newer facilities, plants that were more efficient, less costly to operate, better suited to modern manufacturing processes. All 10,000 workers would be laid off. The plant that had operated continuously since 1910, that had survived wars and depressions and strikes and ownership changes, would shut down by December. The decision wasn't emotional, wasn't personal, wasn't vindictive. It was mathematical, analytical, based on spreadsheets and cost projections and strategic planning. Dodge Main cost more to operate than equivalent production at newer plants. The old buildings required constant maintenance, endless repairs, continuous investment just to keep them minimally functional. The outdated equipment reduced efficiency, increased scrap rates, limited flexibility. The vertical integration that had been an advantage in 1910 was now a liability, requiring Chrysler to maintain expensive foundry operations when they could buy components cheaper from specialized suppliers who achieved economies of scale. The numbers were clear. The logic was irrefutable. Closing Dodge Main would save money, improve efficiency, strengthen Chrysler's competitive position. From a purely financial perspective, the decision was correct. But the mathematics ignored context, ignored history, ignored the human cost. 10,000 workers with nowhere to go, most in their 40s or 50s, too old to easily find new employment, too young to retire on inadequate pensions. A community built entirely around the plant's existence, dependent on it economically and psychologically, with no alternative economic base, no backup plan, no way to survive its closure. 70 years of history, generations of families who had worked at the plant, identities built around being Dodge workers, all of it erased in a corporate memo that treated massive human displacement as an operational detail. The union protested immediately, called meetings, organized demonstrations, threatened strikes, but striking against a closure announcement made no sense. The company wasn't asking for concessions, wasn't negotiating over wages or benefits or working conditions. They were leaving. There was nothing to negotiate, no leverage to apply, no pressure point that could force Chrysler to change course. The UAW's power, built on the threat of stopping production, meant nothing when production was stopping anyway. The union could file grievances, could demand severance packages, could try to extract maximum benefits for laid-off workers. But they couldn't stop the closure. That decision had already been made at levels where worker input was irrelevant. Workers began their final shifts knowing each day brought them closer to the end. They built the last vehicles with the same motions they'd used for decades, muscle memory carrying them through tasks they could perform with eyes closed, movements so practiced they had become automatic, unconscious. Some took tools as souvenirs, wrenches and screwdrivers and small equipment, mementos of decades spent in these buildings, physical objects that would retain value and meaning when the buildings themselves were gone. Others just walked out when their shift ended, not looking back, not wanting to see the buildings one more time, not wanting to process the loss until they had to, until there was no avoiding it. December 21st, 1978. The final vehicle rolled off the assembly line at 3:47 in the afternoon. A brown Dodge truck, specifically a D100 pickup, destined for a dealership somewhere in Ohio. Nothing special about it except that it was last, that it marked the end. The workers on the line signed the dashboard with markers, their names scrawled across the beige plastic, proof that they had been here, that they had built this, that they mattered even if the company treated them as disposable. They took photographs, Polaroids that captured this moment, images that would fade and yellow with time, but would remain as physical evidence of the end. Then they punched out for the last time, walked through the gates they'd entered thousands of times over decades, got in their cars, drove home to uncertain futures. The plant closed at midnight, all operations ceasing simultaneously, furnaces cooling for the first time in 68 years. The lights went dark, building by building. The machines fell silent, the sounds that had defined Hamtramck for 70 years, the industrial symphony of metal on metal, of furnaces roaring, of presses stamping, of engines testing, all of it stopped. The silence was profound, unnatural, disturbing to people who had lived their entire lives with that background noise. The absence was louder than the presence had ever been. Chrysler immediately announced the sale. The entire Dodge main complex, 45 acres, hundreds of buildings, millions of square feet of manufacturing space, decades of accumulated infrastructure and equipment. Asking price, $1, not $1 million, not 100,000, not 1,000, one single dollar. The price you'd pay for a candy bar, the price of nothing. The catch was obvious to anyone who thought about it for 5 seconds. The buyer would inherit all environmental cleanup costs, all demolition expenses, all liability for the site's condition. 70 years of industrial operations had contaminated the soil with heavy metals, oils, chemicals, all the toxic residue of manufacturing processes that predated environmental regulations. Cleaning that contamination to residential or even commercial standards would cost millions, possibly tens of millions. Demolishing hundreds of buildings filled with asbestos and lead paint and structural hazards would cost millions more. Chrysler wanted out completely, wanted to sever all connection to the property, wanted to transfer all responsibility, all liability, all future costs to someone else. They were willing to sell for nothing just to achieve that transfer. They needed the tax write-off more than they needed the money. They needed to focus resources on surviving as a company, on avoiding bankruptcy, on restructuring to compete in a changed market. They couldn't afford to maintain a dead facility, couldn't afford the ongoing costs, couldn't afford the distraction. No one bought, not at $1, not at zero, not if Chrysler paid them. The liabilities exceeded any conceivable value. The complex sat empty through 1979, slowly deteriorating. Windows broken by vandals or just by time, equipment rusting from exposure to the elements, vegetation beginning to reclaim portions of the site. Hamtramck tried to maintain security but lacked funding, lacked personnel, lacked the capacity to monitor 45 acres of abandoned industrial property. Squatters moved into abandoned offices, homeless people seeking shelter, drug users seeking privacy, occasional teenagers exploring the ruins. The plant became dangerous, structurally unsound, criminally active. The city condemned sections, declared them uninhabitable, posted warning signs that no one read or heeded, waited for someone, anyone, to take responsibility for the cleanup. In early 1980, Chrysler contracted with a demolition company. The cost, estimated at $5 million, possibly more depending on what they found during the process. $5 million to destroy what had cost hundreds of millions to build over 7 decades. The company would pay to erase its own history, to eliminate the physical evidence of the plant that had generated billions in revenue, that had employed hundreds of thousands over 7 decades, that had made the Dodge brothers wealthy enough to be remembered a century later. The irony wasn't lost on workers watching from their homes, many still unemployed, many never finding equivalent work again, many facing foreclosure or bankruptcy, or the humiliating necessity of applying for welfare or food stamps. Demolition began in March 1980. The wrecking balls and excavators started with the oldest sections, the buildings from 1910, the original 6-story main structure with its 900 windows. Each impact sent echoes across Hamtramck, audible from blocks away, a percussion of destruction that continued for months. The noise lasted longer than many work shifts, 24 hours a day, as crews worked around the clock to complete the project quickly, to minimize costs, to finish before weather complicated the work. The dust clouds were visible across the city, plumes of pulverized concrete and brick that settled on cars and houses and gardens, coating everything with a fine grey residue that resisted washing, that persisted for weeks. Workers came to watch, standing at the fence line during the day or early evening, seeing their former workplace disappear in dust clouds and collapsing walls. Some cried. Others looked relieved, as if the physical destruction released them from some obligation, some bond they'd felt to the place. Some just stared silently, processing loss too large for words, too complex for easy emotion. The buildings where they'd spent 30 or 40 years, where they'd earned wages that supported families, where they'd formed friendships and feuds and the complicated relationships that develop among people who work side by side for decades. All of it was becoming rubble, becoming memory. And memories fade faster than anyone wants to admit, faster than anyone realizes until it's too late to preserve what mattered. By September 1980, the demolition was complete. 45 acres of empty land, scraped flat to within inches of grade, topsoil removed along with the contaminated surface layers, vegetation killed by decades of chemical exposure and industrial residue. The site looked post-apocalyptic, a wasteland in the middle of a city, surrounded by houses and churches and schools that now looked out onto nothing, onto absence. The city assumed ownership by default, unable to find a buyer, unable to redevelop without investment capital that didn't exist and wasn't coming. The land sat vacant, still sits vacant today, much of it, 40 years after closure, 4 decades of abandonment. Nature has reclaimed some sections, weeds and scrub trees growing through cracked asphalt, creating something that looks almost like wilderness if you don't look too closely. Other sections remain barren, contaminated soil preventing growth, chemical residue poisoning anything that tries to take root. The people of Hamtramck still live in the shadow of what was, in the negative space created by the plant's absence. The population dropped to 27,000 by 1990, to 22,000 by 2000, to 19,000 by 2010. The unemployment rate consistently exceeds state and national averages. The poverty rate approaches 30%. The city struggles to provide basic services with a tax base that never recovered, that never will recover without some new economic foundation that nobody has figured out how to build. Young people leave as soon as they can, immediately after high school if possible, knowing there's nothing for them here. No jobs, no future, no reason to stay except family and the weight of roots that bind even when they shouldn't. The ones who remain are either too old to start over somewhere new, or too poor to afford moving costs, or too attached to place and memory to abandon what their grandparents built. Dodge, Maine is gone, but its absence shapes everything. The numbers tell part of the story, but only part. 35,000 workers at peak employment, 68 years of continuous operation, 2,000 vehicles per day at maximum production, 45 acres of factory floor, 1,400 machine tools, 40 stamping presses, 2,000 tons of metal per day processed through the foundry, $146 million the sale price in 1920, $1 the asking price in 1979, $5 million to demolish what had cost hundreds of millions to build. But numbers don't capture the human scale. They don't show the worker who lost 3 fingers to a stamping press in 1932 and continued working because there was no disability coverage and he had 4 children to feed, who spent 30 more years on the line with a diminished hand, who never complained because complaining accomplished nothing. They don't show the black foundry worker who breathed metal dust for 20 years and died of lung disease at age 48. His death certificate listing natural causes because pneumoconiosis wasn't recognized as occupational illness. His widow receiving nothing because his death wasn't classified as work-related. They don't show the Polish immigrant who arrived in 1920 with nothing but willingness to work, who operated the same lathe for 40 years, who retired in 1960 with a modest pension that allowed him to die with dignity, who lived to see his former plant demolished while his pension fund teetered on insolvency, reducing his monthly payment by 20%, forcing him to move in with his daughter because he couldn't afford rent. Between 1910 and 1978, an estimated 300 workers died from industrial accidents at Dodge, Maine. That number comes from insurance records, union archives, hospital reports, newspaper obituaries, Academic research conducted decades later, it's incomplete by definition. It doesn't include deaths from long-term occupational exposure, from the chronic conditions that develop after decades in hazardous environments. It doesn't include the heart attacks and strokes that came early from stress and physical demands. It doesn't include the suicides that followed layoffs and economic devastation. The real number is higher. How much higher, nobody knows. Nobody counted carefully enough. Nobody thought it mattered enough to maintain comprehensive records. Those 300 documented deaths represent families destroyed, children who grew up without fathers, widows who worked to survive. Each death had a company response: funeral expenses, a small payment equal to a few months' wages, returned to production the next day. One worker's life was worth less than a day of lost production. The company proved it 300 times. But the company also provided employment that allowed hundreds of thousands to build lives, raise families, pursue modest prosperity. Without Dodge Main, Hamtramck wouldn't have existed. The ledger isn't simple. It's compromise, trade-offs, acceptable losses defined by people who never faced those losses personally. The executives who closed Dodge Main weren't monsters. They inherited a company struggling with global competition and changing markets. They made decisions based on financial survival. Sacrificing 10,000 jobs to save the corporation was, from their perspective, rational. But rationality doesn't feed families. When Dodge Main closed, it didn't just eliminate jobs, it erased identities. The worker who spent 40 years on the line lost income, purpose, community, the daily routine that structured his life. Some adapted, most didn't. Most fell into long-term unemployment, burned through savings, lost homes to foreclosure. A significant minority died within 5 years. Heart attacks, strokes, suicides, deaths that never appeared in corporate accounting but were understood by everyone as connected to the plant's fate. The community suffered similarly. Hamtramck had no backup plan. Polish clubs closed. Churches saw attendance decline. Schools struggled with falling enrollment. Downtown became vacant storefronts and check-cashing businesses. Revitalization attempts failed repeatedly. In the 1980s, proposed developments never materialized. In the 1990s, cleanup funding was insufficient. In the 2000s, General Motors built a plant employing 2,000, a fraction of what Dodge Main provided. Today, 40 years after closure, much remains empty. Fenced off, contaminated, waiting. The waiting has become permanent. The survivors wait too, former workers in their 70s and 80s, living on eroded pensions. They gather occasionally at union events that grow smaller each year. Stories get shorter as memories fade. Their children left for cities with growing economies. Their grandchildren never knew Hamtramck as anything but decline, never understood the pride their great-grandfathers felt. The Dodge brothers never saw this. John died in 1920, Horace months later. They died rich and celebrated. Their widows sold everything and walked away clean. The workers stayed through every crisis, stayed because they had no choice, until there was nothing left to stay for. What remains? Photographs of buildings that no longer exist, union records in archives, oral histories. A few plaques most people walk past without reading. Memory, fading with the generation that remembers. Who paid the price for 7 decades of profits? The workers paid. In injuries and deaths, in wages lower than value created, in communities destroyed when economically convenient. They paid with their bodies, their futures. The shareholders got dividends, the executives got bonuses, the workers got laid off, pensions reduced, communities destroyed. That's not opinion, it's accounting. The numbers prove it, if you look carefully, if you include costs that corporate ledgers ignore because there's no requirement to count them. The cost of a life cut short, the cost of a community destroyed, the cost of promises broken, the cost of hope deferred until it dies. Add those costs, and Dodge Main operated at a loss for most of its existence. The loss just fell on people who couldn't refuse to pay, who had no choice, who absorbed the externalities that capitalism generates and attributes to no one in particular, to market forces and structural change and regrettable necessity. Winter evenings in Hamtramck now, January 2025. The kind where darkness falls early and the cold seeps through walls that need repairs nobody can afford. The land where Dodge Main stood is mostly quiet, weeds rustling in the wind, chain-link fences marking property lines that haven't mattered for decades. A few lights glow in the distance. The General Motors plant on the northern section of what was once the complex, operating with a fraction of the workforce Dodge Main employed, producing vehicles for a market that bears little resemblance to the one that sustained 70 years of operation. Old men walk past the fences sometimes, late afternoon when the light is failing, looking at nothing in particular because there's nothing there to see, but seeing buildings that aren't there anymore, hearing sounds that stopped 45 years ago. Their children ask what they're looking at if they're walking together, which happens rarely now. The old men don't always answer. The explanation takes too long, requires context that's difficult to convey, demands engagement with loss that feels too large for casual conversation, too painful to voice without opening emotions they prefer to keep contained. So they walk, and look, and remember. And eventually they go home, to houses they've lived in for 50 years, on streets where half the homes are vacant, where property values are so low that selling isn't viable, even for people who want to leave. They eat dinner alone, or with spouses who are also aging, who also remember. They watch television, shows about different times and different places, worlds that don't resemble the one they live in. They go to bed, wake up the next day, and do it again. Routine sustained through habit, through the simple fact that there's nothing else to do, nowhere else to go, no reason to believe tomorrow will be different from today. The city is still here. 21,000 people according to the most recent census, down from 19,000 a decade ago. A slight increase driven by immigrants from Yemen and Bangladesh, who found cheap housing and established ethnic enclaves. The people are still here. But Dodge Main is gone, and it took something with it that can't be recovered through investment or redevelopment or good intentions. It took certainty. The certainty that hard work guarantees security, that companies value loyalty, that communities built on industry will endure, that America takes care of workers who build America. That certainty was always partial, always contingent, always subject to economic forces beyond local control. But it felt real once, felt permanent, felt like something you could build a life around, something you could promise your children, and now it's gone, proven false by experience, and the absence echoes louder than any machine ever did. The silence is profound. The emptiness is permanent. 45 acres of vacant land waiting, 10,000 workers scattered or dead, 300 deaths across 70 years, $1. That's what 7 decades of history cost in the end. $1 and everything else invisible, uncounted, externalized to people who couldn't refuse to pay. Was it worth it? Ask the shareholders who received dividends for 70 years, who sold their stock at profits, who never set foot in the plant or met a single worker. Ask the executives who managed the plant and climbed corporate ladders into comfortable retirements. Ask the bankers who arranged the sales and took their fees. Ask the consumers who bought vehicles built by workers they never met, in conditions they never witnessed, at costs they never considered. Then ask the workers, ask the 300 who died on the job, ask the 10,000 who lost everything when the plant closed, ask the community that still struggles in the ruins. You'll get different answers, completely different answers. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the question was never whether it was worth it. Maybe the question is, worth it for whom, and at what price, and who decided, and who profited, and who paid. And does anyone who benefited remember the names of those who didn't? The buildings are gone, demolished, turned to rubble that was hauled away to landfills. The machines are gone, sold for scrap or junked or rusting in warehouses somewhere. The workers are dying, slowly, naturally, inevitably, carrying stories that won't survive them because no one thought to record them systematically, because oral history projects only capture fragments, because memory isn't archival. Hamtramck remains, diminished, surviving rather than thriving, waiting for a future that feels increasingly distant, increasingly impossible. The land waits too, patient, empty, contaminated. Ready for something new, if anyone ever figures out what that might be, if anyone ever decides it's worth the investment, if anyone ever cares enough to try. Until then, the wind blows through vacant lots. Old men walk past fences. The city endures the way ruins endure, slowly eroding, stubbornly present, defined more by what's missing than by what remains, marked by absence, shaped by loss, haunted by ghosts that no one bothers to name. 35,000 workers, 70 years of history. $1. The question wasn't whether someone paid the price. The question is whether anyone who benefited remembers their names. The answer is silence. The same silence that fills the empty land where the plant once stood. The same silence that greets the old men walking past fences. The same silence that waits for someone to say these names mattered, these lives mattered, this community deserved more than $1. 70 years, 35,000 workers, $1. That's what history cost. That's what remains when everything else is demolished and forgotten.